Welcome back to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink, Friday morning, March 29th. Happy to be joined by Tony Adragna. He has two great resources out there now for IU fans. His film room, which is over on the Assembly Call Substack. And he also has a new transfer portal tracker. I believe it's at iuportaltracker.com. Just a really good tool for being able to kind of look at where Indiana is looking in the transfer portal at this time. I know all of us who follow IU and cover it are trying to track down everything we can on social media in terms of which players Indiana's been in contact with, and Tony's done a good job of keeping track of that over on that new site. So I recommend checking that out. Welcome back to the show, Tony. Thanks for taking the time on this Friday morning.
Yeah, happy to be here. Yeah, the IU portal tracker was my brain really struggles to follow the tracking in paragraph format with this is this guy's stats, this is a little bit of a scouting report, and here's some, and so I built this database basically for my own visual of just this is how I like to see it. And it turns out some other folks kind of enjoy that table format as well. So I was like, screw it, I'll throw it online, and as I try to track it myself, maybe can help some other folks track some things down too. So yeah, it's pretty fun. It's got who IU's reached out to, who's visiting. Once guys do commit to Indiana, inevitably, it'll have that, and it's got some film stuff on it. It's got visit dates, stats, outreach, confirmations, and things like that. So yeah, I kind of did it for myself, but if other people enjoy kind of seeing things in that format too, then I figured I'd throw it out there to other folks as well.
Yeah, I know the minute I saw it published, I sent you, I think, a direct message on X and said, thanks for doing this, because it's a great resource. And, I'm trying to do the same thing in terms of keeping track of things on Inside the Hall. But I really like the fact that you have all the advanced stats in there and keeping it in that table format. I think there's a lot of value in that. So I know the IU fans are appreciative of you doing that. I'm curious, just from your perspective, I do want to get into Bryson Tucker and some other portal things, but just to ask you in terms of this portal tracker, how hard has it been, just as an IU fan, someone that follows the program to this point, being able to parse who Indiana's actually interested in the portal, who they've just reached out to? It seems like this year more than ever, there's more names popping up, and it's been a little bit more difficult to kind of narrow down a list, or even make something like a hot board in terms of a list of priorities.
Absolutely. Yeah. I feel like, we're covering Arkansas this year, who, every year it seems they reach out to every player that goes into the portal. When I look at it, I'm more so looking at when I see Indiana reached out to somebody, first and foremost, it's okay, do they fit kind of what this roster mold would look like? If they're reaching out to a stretch four, more times than not, I mean, unless the guy's just lights out, Grant Nelson or something, and you're just gonna find a way to make that guy, put that guy in your lineup. I think Indiana's made it pretty clear they want Malik Renew to be their starting four, and so when I see they reach out to a four or something like that, it's okay, maybe, or a wing that would play at the three, assuming McKenzie and Mbako comes back, especially now that Bryson Tucker's in the fold. It's okay, that's may not be a real situation where Indiana has legitimate interest. So that's first and foremost, is just kind of looking at what's the fit here. I think one thing we're seeing too in this portal season, I mean, you look at the guys visiting this week, are guys that were in situations elsewhere but have some Indiana ties, or from Indiana, and Leland Walker and Connor Hickman. So it's that piece of it makes some sense as well, of some guys that may be able to come home and transfer up. So those situations make a lot of sense for Indiana too. But yeah, so that's where first and foremost kind of what I'm looking at. And then, the other teams involved too makes sense. So you and I have swapped some messages on X about a guy like Malik Mack. It's all right, the guy seems like he's pretty much a Georgetown lock, in terms of where he's going. Which, a side note, hilarious. He has Maryland Terrapin literally tattooed on his forearm, and probably will never play for Maryland. But you never know in the portal season. So, yeah, like you said, I mean, right now I've got 21 or 22 guys that, I've had confirmed outreach from Indiana. Some of those have already committed elsewhere. So trying to figure out where these guys fit and if Indiana's serious in their outreach, and then if that's reciprocated is certainly an interesting thing here. And there's, for me, I'm just kind of a fan more than anything. For guys like you, and some of the other guys that cover this, for a living, it's like these are such short recruitments. It's just about impossible to have connections all over the place that would know if, what the actual interest is in some of these guys, and, talking to their, whether that be their AAU coaches, their circle, their agents, all that stuff. Like, I don't envy the people that are actually, trying to dive into the nitty gritty of these things to figure out where the interest lies, who else is talking to them, things like that. So I'm appreciative of folks like you and some of the others, and then the national guys. Like, I can't even imagine like the guys that are doing this nationally on the recruiting front of trying to figure out who has interest, who doesn't, who they've heard from. The heard from stuff is always hilarious to me too, because that could mean anything from just like a text message or a DM on Twitter all the way to, actual legitimate interest in somebody. So like you said, trying to parse through all that and figure it out is kind of the fun of this right now as an Indiana fan or somebody that covers Indiana, because, there's not any basketball to be watching. So this does take up some of that time. That makes it a little bit more fun. So yeah, I'm enjoying it in a different way. Obviously, I would prefer Indiana to be playing, but if they're not, this is kind of fun to keep track of.
Yeah, it's kind of extended the season, for someone that creates content, assembly call, got, inside the hall, sites like Peegs and Rivals and all the countless other Indiana media outlets out there, the newspapers as well. It's kind of given, an extension of the season. I mean, some may like it from a coverage perspective and like to get after the stuff. It may be an annoyance to some to try to cover all of this stuff, but you can't doubt that it's fast moving and a lot of fun. And you're right, it's impossible to try to keep up with what a contact means when there's 20 or 25 names out there. You don't even know where to start. That's why guys like Joe Tipton with what he's doing on his Twitter account are so valuable. And some of these other Twitter accounts, which I don't know who runs some of them, but there's specifically just portal update Twitter accounts that, I've retweeted numerous times over the last couple weeks, where it almost seems like information's getting funneled to these accounts and as well as Joe Tipton. And that's kind of the best way probably for these guys to manage that, because if you're hearing from 20 schools and all of a sudden 20 media members from 20 different schools are trying to contact the kid plus manage the contact with the schools, I mean, there's just no time to do that. So in a situation like this, it's basically, this is how it's going to work. And I think these things are going to move quickly, and there may not be a ton of information out there on certain guys before they even commit. We'll see how it all plays out. I want to ask you, obviously, about the news with Bryson Tucker. It feels like, from an Indiana perspective, there's been so many twists and turns. I mean, it was just a little bit over a month ago where Liam McNeely decommitted and Indiana had this losing streak, and everyone wondered if the sky was falling, and there was questions about Mike Woodson's job. And since then, obviously, pretty strong finish to the season. Minus the loss to Nebraska in the Big Ten tournament, and then picking up kind of out of nowhere. I think it was just earlier this week, a couple days ago, that we heard about the Bryson Tucker being on campus for a visit, and then he's committing a couple days later. Just from what you've seen of him on film, what needs, if any, does he address for next season? And fourth straight year now in the spring where Mike Woodson has been able to close on one of these people are calling short recruitments, but Tamar Bates, Malik Renew, Mackenzie Mbako, and now Bryson Tucker in the fold, all spring commitments and relatively short recruitments.
Yeah, the first part of it, pretty bizarre, because the first three of those recruitments were like huge deals on the Indiana front. Like fans were fully immersed in those recruitments. Everybody knew those guys were visiting. There was, tea leaves to read about, are they going to commit soon after? With Mbako, it was Kansas and Indiana. He had a decision date set. This one just flew under the radar. So it was really weird in terms of how it kind of all played out. Like, I think a week ago, if you asked most IU fans, like, what do you think about Bryson Tucker? They would be like, Bryson Tiller? Like, it was like, there wasn't a lot of intrigue about him. Like, everybody kind of thought in the recruiting circles he was going on G League Ignite until that folded. So it was one of the more bizarre recruitments I can recall because it was so just like under the radar and just like nobody even knew what was happening. It sounds like the kid has a really tight circle and doesn't talk to a lot of media. And so, it was just kind of out of the blue. Like nobody even knew he was visiting. It was just like, hey, he's on campus right now. I saw something on Twitter or something where somebody was just like, I just saw Mike Woodson walk into like Uptown with a couple guys, no idea who they are. And then, it turns out it was like that visit happening. So really weird recruitment because it was just like, and then there was no like super high highs and super low lows of like, I think he's going to Kansas or, it was just like, hey, this kid visited. And then like 2 days later, it's like, all right, he's committed to Indiana. So that part of it was unique. I can't recall a 5-star recruitment happening quite like that on the Indiana front, at least, and at least as long as I've been following this closely. So that was really unique in terms of his play. I've dove into his film the last few days, just trying to figure out where he fits into this Indiana team and his skill set. I mean, first and foremost, like I think his best, like many guys, I think his best play is probably going to be at the pro level. Like I think he's going to feel some things out at the college level. He's going to showcase, his skill set and pro. I mean, pro prospects. He looks like a first round NBA draft pick. I mean, he's got the length, the versatility in his game. He's 6'7", he's got like a +3 wingspan out to 6'10". His dad is 6'10" or 6'11", so he still may have some room to grow there. His frame, like he's got nice broad shoulders, so he can add some weight on without it, messing up his body or anything like that. And then he's got a nice handle. He's got a nice looking jump shot, and now he's much better with that jump shot in the mid range, which I know there's some IU fans right now listening to that and like, oh boy, here we go. He is much better in the mid range than he is from the outside. But I will say, I looked at some of his numbers. Not great shooting the basketball. In a limited sample size I saw on Synergy, I think it was like 10 games or something like that they had documented on Synergy. He took 52 jumpers off the dribble, which is a lot. He only made 10 of them. So that part of his game is a little bit worrisome. But then when I dove into the film, I was like, okay, like he's taking really hard shots that he would literally never be allowed to take at Indiana, or I can't imagine he'd be allowed to take, like, step back, fadeaways. He's got 3 guys on him. And I wrote about this in Substack. It's like high school basketball is the most unique thing in the world because you've got like a future NBA player playing against, a 5'11" kid that will never play basketball beyond high school. And so like when you've got a team of those guys that are, never going to play basketball beyond high school, like a guy like Bryson Tucker is going to have the attention of all 5 guys on defense. And that's what I saw a lot of in film is he drew a lot of double and triple teams and he shot out of those a lot. And that's just a situation he's never going to have to deal with at the college level and certainly not the pro level. He has a nice, smooth game. He understands change of pace, change of direction, and keeping guys on their toes. And like that's the type of stuff that is really that's like oozing the pro potential, is understanding those things. I think he's more polished, like from a basketball standpoint, than Mackenzie Mbako was coming into college basketball. I don't think he's quite as skilled and understands how to use his body as good as Mbako did. So, in terms of his fit with the Hoosiers, I think coming off the bench as a wing is probably his best, like where he can best be utilized. And maybe it slides Mbako up to the 4 with some, Malik Renew minute. Malik Renew gets in foul trouble or whatever the case may be, or Malik Renew goes to the 5, and you slide Tucker in there at the 3. I don't see if Mbako comes back and you've already got Renew at the 4, presumably Indiana's probably going to go after a portal 5. I can't see where Tucker would start at the 2. I mean, you'd have a really, really large lineup with not a lot of versatility. So I think he slots in nicely at an off the bench wing. Obviously the staff sold him on whatever that role they're thinking for him is, and obviously we're not privy to that information, but that's where I could see him slotting in, to start next season.
One thing that stood out to me just looking at his bio, and he's only 17 right now, and he doesn't turn 18 until July. So you talked about the potential to grow, maybe get, who knows? I've heard of guys growing, continuing to grow once they get into college. So maybe he could add another inch or two to his height, and I wonder how that changes his game, if at all. And also in terms of Mbako, the comparison, I watched some film on him yesterday morning, put out a video on YouTube of some of his highlights from last season. I agree with you in terms of not knowing how to use his body as well, but he's a lot more fluid of an athlete, I feel like, in the way he
Yep.
moves around the court than Mbako was and probably is at this point. So definitely going to have to add some strength to play right away in the Big Ten, but the talent will be something that you can't keep off the floor. And I too am curious just kind of how he fits in terms of a lineup, because obviously you've got Galloway coming back. They're going after some other guards in the portal right now. The big question mark, I guess, is how this impacts Mackenzie Mbako, if at all. I assume if Mbako comes back, he's going to continue to start at the 3. And so really it would be, if Tucker would start, it'd be at the 2. And I just don't know if the shooting part of it is good enough for him to start right away, but can still be a guy that, if he does come off the bench, can give you 20, 25 minutes a game as a freshman, and looks definitely, there's not going to be many teams in the Big Ten that have that type of talent, either in the starting lineup or coming off the bench. So I think that's, some reasons to be encouraged by him. In terms of the portal at large right now, we kind of talked about just all these different names coming up. Like Tony Perkins from Iowa is a name that you're hearing a lot. Connor Hickman of Bradley, Connor Essegian, Wisconsin. There's been, I would say, less bigs come up to this point. More, it seems like it's more guard heavy, but I agree with you that they're going to need a 5. Let's say Mackenzie Mbako does come back. It seems like they still have 6 scholarships open to play with. I don't know if you fill all of those. Maybe you leave one open going into the season. What in your mind are like the essential things that they have to get from this point moving forward to feel good about where they are in terms of a roster going into next season?
Yeah, those names you mentioned, with actually one thing I do want to mention about Tucker before we go to that is that
Sure.
I think too, people will look at these like one and done situations, especially from like Indiana fan standpoint, and they're like, well, you got to start the kid if, he wants to be a one and done. Like, you don't. Like, Reed Shepherd came off the bench all year for Kentucky. There are some mock drafts that had him as number 1 pick, which I didn't totally agree with, but you can showcase that you are a potential NBA player coming off of the bench. College production does not equal NBA production. And so that's one thing I want people to keep in mind is like, well, you got to keep these 5 stars happy and start them so that they can go pro. Like, you don't have to start to showcase like you've got the skill set and the athleticism to be an NBA player. And so I do want people to keep that in mind. Like, you can 100% come off the bench and still be a lottery NBA pick. Kentucky's had number of those guys. Not saying Indiana's anywhere on that level of getting
They had
guys.
Devin Booker coming off the bench.
Absolutely. So that is one thing I wanted people to keep in mind is like, you can sell a plan of getting a guy to the NBA and still not start him. And I think that's what we may see with Tucker, but time will tell. And, then transferring to the transfer portal, if Indiana does land a guy like Tony Perkins, I think a 29% 3-point shooter last season, you absolutely have to go get a dynamic combo guard to go alongside that. If that is the route that Indiana takes, from what I've been hearing, Indiana's gonna be in the final mix for Perkins. in what he's able to offer. Now with Perkins, I think he offers a lot of, obviously, senior leadership, guy that's been through the grind of the season. He was a 14 point per game guy last season with Iowa, has a high assist rate. I think his assist rate was like 25 or 26%. So like he offers a lot of the things that a healthy Xavier Johnson offered you. I think he raises your floor certainly at Indiana. He doesn't have some of the other stuff, I guess, that Xavier Johnson brought into the mix, for better or for worse. He's seems to be pretty level headed, and he just goes out there. He played in a really good offensive system, so I think his numbers would go down at Indiana. Iowa has long been one of the best offenses in the Big Ten, if not the country, and so I think his numbers would likely go down, especially from a scoring standpoint and production standpoint. If that's a guy Indiana goes after. But like I said, you got to have a combo guard that can go get a shot to pair with him. And then you start talking about like, okay, well, then does that bring Galloway off the bench? Things like that. So there's a lot of puzzle pieces that you have to fit together. If that is somebody that you go out and get, we mentioned Leland Walker is also on campus this weekend. Connor Hickman is on campus this weekend. Connor Hickman is a guy that I think probably pairs nicely with a Tony Perkins in terms of he's able to handle the ball. He's got decent size at 6'3", good offensive rating, decent assist rate, pretty low turnover rate. And then, from the 3-point line, shot 74 of 182 last season. So over 40% 3-point shooter last season. If you have a pairing like that from an athleticism and length standpoint, you might not be at the level of like teams you're seeing play this weekend. But your floor is certainly raised. And then you've got, guys like Mbako, Renew, and then, like I said, some Portal 5 in the mix as well. That will be important for Indiana moving forward. But, Indiana's just got a weird dynamic with Mbako at the 3 and Malik Renew at the 4, where you're going to be lacking some athleticism in your lineup because you're just starting guys that in other programs maybe your 4 and your 5, so you're kind of slotting them down a notch, and you're going to be a little bit bigger than some other teams and probably less athletic than those teams. But those are kind of my thoughts on if Indiana kind of goes down the route of these guys that we've heard them connected with. Now, obviously, the portal is open for a couple months. We're certainly going to see some other guys come in, around Final Four time too. So people don't like to hear it, but like back channeling does happen. Indiana may know there's some other guys coming to the fold that they're more interested in. Us, as fans and media members, we don't necessarily know about those guys until it happens. So it's interesting. As a staff, there's just so many moving pieces that they've got to have plan A through plan Z of if this guy portals and if he comes here and whatnot. So it's a really interesting dynamic.
You mentioned needing a 5, and I agree with you completely on that. Are the two biggest things Indiana needs to find in terms of a 5, the rebounding piece and the rim protection piece, and maybe less of a scorer, but based on who they have on the roster already?
I think 100%. I honestly, from a fan standpoint, I hope they do not go after a guy that's like a back to the basket, high point per game guy or high usage guy. Honestly, who Indiana goes after at the 5 is going to tell us a lot probably about their style of play next season and what they're trying to do. I know a lot of folks got frustrated last season with kind of the too big lineup, the paint not wide open or anything like that. Like, if you can go get a guy that rebounds super well, protects the rim super well, and catches lobs off of ball screens, like that's who you should go get. Now, a lot of people are like, "Oh, so you're talking about Kalo Ware?" That's kind of the player that Kalo Ware could have been, but he played with the ball in his hands a lot too, and played with his back to the basket more than some fans probably would have liked. But what I do want to iterate to fans is like the two big system can work. Purdue does it with Trey Kaufman-Renn and Zach Edey and First when he's in there and things like that. Like, it's not necessarily playing the two bigs. It's how you utilize those two bigs. And you've got to have floor spacing. You can't park two bigs on the blocks and things like that and just not allow your guards to operate once they get into the paint. And that was kind of more of my gripe with Indiana's offensive system. It wasn't that you've got two bigs in the game. It's how you utilize those two bigs when they're in there.
Last thing before we wrap up on this episode, Tony, just in general, I know you've been pretty outspoken just in terms of the IU program and the disappointment of last season. How how optimistic are you at this point after the Tucker commitment and what you've seen so far out of the portal that Indiana can put together a team for next year that's going to be back in the NCAA tournament? Is it too early to tell on that front, or do you have some optimism that things may be trending in a better direction?
Yeah, I think when you look at who Indiana is going after in the portal, predominantly being kind of scoring guards and combo guards, it certainly shows some awareness from the staff that they obviously knew their guard situation was not up to snuff last year in terms of competing with the big dogs, and not even in the Big Ten. Like, Indiana obviously ended up decently ranked in the Big Ten. But when they went up against top tier competition, Indiana's guards were just so clearly outmatched. And that was even with Xavier Johnson in the fold for some of those games. But when you looked at their games against the UConns, the Auburns, the Illinois, the Purdue's, like, Indiana's guard play just absolutely killed them in terms of being able to compete with those teams. And so who they're going after in the portal is certainly more reason for optimism based on what they can do next season. But in terms of like being able to grade how optimistic I am right now, obviously that we'll need some more time to figure out how things shape up here in the portal. But I would say I'm cautiously optimistic. It looks like there's some recognition that what happened last year certainly didn't work, and Indiana knows that. But like I said, really figuring out who Indiana gets at the 5 spot is going to tell me a lot about how they're going to play next season. And that will certainly kind of dictate where my feelings are going into next season. Now, obviously, who they land and the talent level will make a big difference too. But yeah, I'm really keen on what's Indiana looking for at the 5 spot. And that'll kind of tell us what their style of play may look like. And then I'll be able to kind of have some thoughts on where the program's headed for next season.
Yeah, I think they're going to get talent, obviously. I think the more important thing to kind of watch and monitor, and it's going to take time before we can even see this, because all this work's going to be done over the summer. But the part that they have to get right now is just in terms of getting the pieces that are coming into the program and willing to play the role that they're recruited for and want to win basketball games. Because the one thing that you can't really judge out of the portal when you're recruiting these guys in such a short time frame is you don't really know them in terms of people, what really makes them tick. And obviously the NIL piece has made it even more difficult to kind of decipher. And obviously guys are going to make decisions with NIL in mind, and that's fine. But also, how much are they committed to Indiana and helping Indiana win basketball games, as opposed to are they just in it for the NIL money? And that's something that, we saw several teams like in Arkansas last year. They kind of just went full out on the portal and collected a lot of talent, and it didn't necessarily pan out. So that's a challenge that Mike Woodson and the coaching staff have ahead of them. And I don't think there's any doubt they're going to get some talented pieces, but how it all fits together and how they're able to, make it into a team that fits together when the games actually start is a story that we're really not going to see play out until next fall. But it's fun to follow along. And Tony, I appreciate the time today coming on talking some Bryson Tucker and transfer portal.
Absolutely. Always happy to talk with you, Alex. And like you said, it's been a nice little extension of the season. Obviously, fans would prefer that, Indiana's gearing up for their Sweet 16 matchup in this weekend. But it is nice to still talk some hoops and figure out where Indiana may be. And the portal moves so fast. Like while we were having this conversation, who knows who entered, who left, who committed where. So
Right.
that part of it makes it fun as well.
Well, make sure to check out Tony's work over on the Assembly Call Substack. His film room work there is terrific. And also IUportaltracker.com that he created. I talked about earlier in the show. I think it's an excellent resource. If you like me and Tony like to see kind of a list in more of a table format and more advanced stats, and he's done some film work over there as well on a lot of these guys. That's really good stuff. It's a free resource, so check it out. And as always, thank you for listening to Podcast on the Brink. If you enjoy the show, as always, please leave us a rating or a review over on Apple Podcasts. Leave us a rating on Spotify, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.